the Triathlon Show 379. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Dr. Jason Boynton. Jason is a sports scientist and cycling coach, and he's the co-host of the Cycling Performance Club podcast along with Damien Roos and Cyrus Monk. The topics of today's interview are all related to critical thinking, knowledge, evidence, and how to make better decisions, smarter decisions, well-informed decisions within endurance sports. And it is an unusually long episode, as you can see, but I think that it's good. It was really important to explain all of these concepts in detail and fully, and not just brush over any of them. So I hope that we did a decent job with that, and that you will enjoy this conversation and be able to take a lot from it. But before we get into the interview, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that help athletes perform at their best with electrolyte and fueling products, as well as with free online tools, education, and a patented sweat test. You can use the free fuel and hydration planner on their website to get a personalized plan for carbohydrate, sodium, and fluid intake. And you can also book a free 20-minute video consultation to chat through your plan with the athlete support team. As a salty sweater myself, their highly concentrated electrolytes are very important to me in long workouts and in racing. And the gels are super important when I want to be consuming carbohydrates in large quantities. I can do that easily with the Precision Fuel gels without any sort of gastrointestinal issues or even palate fatigue. You can get 15% off your first order by using the code TTS23 on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to ZEN8. The ZEN8 Indoor Swim Trainer is a unique Dryland Swim Trainer that allows you to improve your technique, power, and swim training consistency. It is a perfect tool to complement your pool and open water swimming, and it allows you to do very specific power and technique work, including working on your catch and your core activation. It also makes it easier to stay consistent even when you can't go to the pool. You can try the ZEN8 for risk-free for up to 30 days, so if you don't love it, just send it back. And you can get a special bundle including the ZEN8 Swim Trainer and a bunch of ZEN8 training plans and on-demand workouts on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, here's the interview with Dr. Jason Boynton. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, Jason. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing all right. How are you doing, Michael?
Yeah, doing good. Good, thanks. Can you start by an introduction? Who are you?
Well, first off, thanks for having me. Appreciate that. That was kind of a random message to you, so thanks for inviting me on and having a talk with you. But so I am Jason Boynton, Dr. Jason Boynton, and I am a sports scientist, an exercise physiologist, and a cycling coach. And I'm also the co-host of the Cycling Performance Club podcast, which is how you kind of know me, I guess. Yeah. And I guess if you want to compress all of that, I think my Twitter does a good job of kind of relaying of it's just sports scientist plus physiologist plus cycling coach each equals cyclist engine builder, which is kind of I think an easier way to express what I do as opposed to just like sports scientist. You just do research, that's kind of who I am. Is that
you're not doing academic research at the moment. You're coaching.
Yeah, primarily coaching right now, and talking with other researchers and that type of stuff through the podcast and that. So, that's what I do.
What was your academic focus when you did your PhD?
When I did my PhD, I looked at the environmental temperature effects, or I looked at how environmental temperature affects high intensity interval training. So, and trained cyclists. And that was two big studies. One was a cross-sectional study, and another one was a training study comparing intervals in two different temperatures. And that's sitting on someone's desk at a journal right now, waiting to get peer reviewed.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And for that reason, we won't go too deep into that topic today. We can save that for another discussion when everything is published. But one thing that you referenced your Twitter, and I went and had a look at your Twitter, and it's a pretty interesting feed, and a lot of the things that you write about, I guess, comes back to topics like critical thinking, levels of evidence, and things like that. And then you also have a YouTube video on that topic. Basically, you call it "Finding Truth in Endurance Sport," and I think that was a really good video. I watched it in its entirety. It was a 1 hour long video, but very beneficial to watch. So, can you discuss a little bit about that? What is finding truth in endurance sport for you?
Well, first of all, sorry for bringing you on to Twitter. It's a bit of a dumpster fire, and I'm definitely not putting out fires on Twitter. But getting back to the video, I came out with this back in 2014. So if you watch it, the science is a little bit dated. I've obviously changed my opinion on some of the stuff that's on there, but I think the overall message is pretty important. And the idea around, what I think is kind of a missing component of training and coaching, is this basic understanding of what do we know and how do we know it? How do we know, something about training, and how do we know that something is true? And these are two, I think, really important fundamental questions to kind of look deeply at, especially for coaches out there, because you should be asking why you are prescribing something or recommending something to somebody, and where you have those core beliefs that would make you make those decisions. And from my understanding, I never went through any kind of training like that when I went through my coaching certifications with USA Cycling. Maybe there's some places that are talking about that now, but it's you get courses like that in college around like critical thinking courses and things. But I think it's a really important way to kind of frame our approach to training and developing athletes and making them perform better. Is that kind of what you grasped from that?
Yeah, and I would probably say that it's you said it's very good for or important for coaches prescribing training, but I would say we have a lot of self-coached athletes listening, and I would say that it's equally important, especially in this day and age where you can consume so much information, including this podcast. You have to make some informed decisions about how you want to do your training based on all the things that you hear and know or think you know, and some critical thinking skills and understanding levels of evidence, I think is important, whether you're a coach or just a self-coached athlete.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things I think I used in that video to kind of, pique interest in people when they first started watching it was just saying, like, look back at some of the things that people seriously did in order to improve their performance, like smoking cigarettes before big climbs or drinking wine during the Tour de France. Like, that's not a joke. We would assume that they really believe that was going to help them. And why would we think that we're any better? Why would we? I mean, it's easy to have that kind of maybe intellectual arrogance about ourselves because we're so modern or whatever, but we've obviously have things that we're doing now that we know are wrong, or someone in society or someone knows that it's incorrect because they have the data on it. But then there's probably all these things that we are doing wrong nowadays that we don't know about. So how do we know if something is false, and how do we correct this? Because the better we understand reality, I mean, the thought experiment being, imagine if you were omniscient and you knew everything, and you could make every single decision about your training correctly. You knew exactly how many hours you needed to rest before you could hit the next interval session, or you knew if it was more beneficial to do the interval session fatigued or fresh. Imagine like if you got your cadence perfect, your nutrition perfect. Like imagine if you were basically God of training and you could set somebody up like that. Imagine you would hit, that athlete would hit their ceiling of potential. But we're nowhere near that. I can definitely guarantee you that. So it's just a matter of like, well, how do we get to the point where we are slowly, gradually approaching that perfection and that, knowledge or the higher levels of knowledge, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think you touched on an important point there, even though you didn't mention the word, but I started thinking that, well, humility is really important when it comes to coaching and training, being humble about how much we don't really know and how much of what we maybe think is good practice, but we cannot be sure that it's best practice necessarily, even though it might be working fine, but maybe there's a better way. Or we think it's working fine, but it's actually something else that is working, and what we think is working fine is actually neutral or even a negative effect. So I think that's an important attribute to have. But if we kind of dig a bit deeper, critical thinking when it comes to training, what is that? How would you define it, and how can people acquire that?
I guess it's just being as objective as you can about analyzing and evaluating situations. Kind of these, the framework and the kind of, I guess, terms that we'll be talking about here in a second here, they have a lot of overlap. So it's hard to kind of look at them individually, because as soon as you're talking about, critical thinking, the next thing you start talking about is, well, be skeptical about claims. And then you're defining skepticism. And what's skepticism? Well, that's, asking for a higher level of evidence for claims that are made, and, suspending your judgment and having a reasonable amount of doubt, right? So those two things will work together. And then two things that I've added since the video, two other concepts, is the idea of falsifiability, which is a really, really important idea in science, which is this idea of if there's a claim or you have a hypothesis about something, it has to be able to be proven wrong in some way. And that's really fine and dandy when you're designing scientific studies, but it's also something to kind of keep in the back of your mind when you are when you're doing your coaching practice. For example, if I always pick on HIIT because that was part of my research. I asked myself, well, what evidence would I need to see that HIIT doesn't work?
High intensity interval training, just to make sure everybody's with us.
Yeah. So and so I can conceive of evidence that I would see, and in situations that I could see where high intensity interval training isn't necessary or beneficial. Whether or not that's the case, I don't know, but I can at least conceive of situations where I would drop high intensity interval training, even though I think it's one of the most, I do think it is a fundamental component of endurance training. But even though I feel it is, or believe it is fundamental, I could still conceive of situations where maybe we don't need it, if that makes sense. So
yes, but how does it relate to falsifiability?
All right. So that I have this belief that high intensity interval training is a foundation, and I am asking myself, what kind of evidence would I accept that it isn't a foundation?
Okay.
Does that kind of make sense? Like there's an open door. It's basically an open door to that I will accept new evidence that maybe this isn't the case.
Yeah.
Right. And each one of my beliefs.
What is an example of something that would not be falsifiable?
Oh, you could look at HIIT as unfalsifiable if you didn't accept any evidence to the contrary.
Oh, okay. So it's more about your personal.
In that context, but you could also things like ghosts. Ghosts, most people frame the idea of ghosts is unfalsifiable. If you say, well, you can't measure ghosts because, as soon as you try to measure them, the ghosts will escape that ability to measure it. Well, that's not falsifiable, right? Because there's no evidence that can make you change your idea about it.
Another example that just came to mind for me right now is a big pet peeve of mine when watching sports, when watching endurance sports, especially. Commentators will often say something along the lines of, now it's down to who wants it the most. You're in the final kilometer of the run in a triathlon. And that is something that you would, at least with current methods and what we can measure and test, I don't think, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that that's something that you couldn't prove. It would be unfalsifiable because that's not something that you could possibly prove or disprove. Would that be an example?
Yeah, but then it comes down to like how much does the claim really matter? Sometimes too, I guess
it doesn't. But that's where people can say that, and I guess it's normal commentary. But to me, it always makes me cringe when I hear it because I think that, well, how can you possibly say that? Because I don't think it's about that really. I think that if you're looking at watching the Olympics, for example, and you have the two fastest triathletes or cyclists going head to head in the final part of the race, then it could be about it, but it's probably but it could also be about a number of other things. It could be about who's the fittest, which would make sense.
And that's another thing about just like appreciating in endurance training and how it is heavily physiological in its basis. So, that means it's going to be highly multifactorial, your outcomes, which, it gets back to like, well, it depends how that happened. Right. But I guess in terms of falsifiability, when you're designing a study, then it's really important that these studies are falsifiable. That's important there. So it's a slightly different context, I think, that when you're designing a good scientific study, that the outcome is falsifiable, and then, but then I think having that kind of falsifiability that's kind of internalized, for lack of better word, just being, I have these beliefs, but I have ways I can conceive of evidence that would make me change my mind. Yeah. Right. But just to kind of exhibit the importance of falsifiability, one of the examples I have is this idea of the pre-flight checklist. Right. So flying is, that's crazy, right? Like you're flying in the sky but somehow we have these airplanes that just float in the air and there's thousands of them every day, but somehow we have very low crash rates. And this can come back to this idea of the pre-flight checklist. So imagine if you are on a small Caribbean island and you come up to two pilots standing next to their airplanes, and you're like, well, which one of you guys are ready to go? And the first pilot says, I'm ready to go. And the second one says, I'll be ready to go as soon as I do a pre-flight checklist. And you look at the first pilot and you say, did you do a pre-flight checklist? And he says, no. Look at the plane. It's ready to go. It has 2 wings. I just put fuel in it. It's ready to go. And then the other guy, he finishes up his checklist and he's ready to go. Which one of these 2 pilots are you going with?
The one that did the check, of course.
The checklist, right?
Yeah.
And that checklist is there because the claim is that the airplane is ready to fly. And the checklist is going through and trying to falsify that claim, right? There's no gas. There's not enough gas in here. Is there gas in here? Okay, well, what's the next thing? We're going to try to falsify whether or not this plane is ready to go. So you can see if that first pilot is not willing to change his opinion, if that is his regular way of determining if his plane is ready to fly just by looking at it and not doing a pre-flight checklist, you can see how that could end in tears at some point.
Yeah.
Right. Because he's not able to kind of question his reality. Yeah. So yeah, maybe hopefully that's not too much of a tangent, but like, I think it's important if you, for example, if you are doing a training intervention or an approach, if you're a coach and things aren't going away with an athlete, at what point do you say it's me, not them? And where do you start breaking apart your intervention or whatever to figure out, is this really working the way I think it is? But yeah, then that comes into another concept that was in the video, which is intellectual honesty, which can be very hard for an athlete or a coach to look at something in a very honest manner if the outcome hurts them or does not benefit them. So, if I've set up this whole thing as a, I think we're going to talk about intervals quite a bit today, but if you ask me about intervals and I go on your show and we record my approach to intervals and I'm like, yeah, I have this level of evidence and I'm pretty certain it works. And then it comes out with some other research a few years later that my thinking on it was wrong. Well, if it benefits me to ignore that evidence in a sense, just to be willfully ignorant of it. But at the end of the day, that's not a good way. Like that doesn't benefit my athletes, right? To ignore that part of reality. So making sure you're looking at things, even if it means, maybe you're going to have to pull apart a big part of your practice or something like that, right? If something doesn't work, or if there's something that does work that you've been ignoring, or something like that. But yeah, I guess
would you say that this is related to the fact that there's a whole lot of unpublished research when there are when the research doesn't get results? There are no positive results of the research. Does that align with this concept of intellectual honesty?
Yeah, well, there could be an overlap with there. That's kind of what an unfortunate thing that does occur within with journals and that. I think the good scientists out there and the good editors are going to be pro publishing of non-results or negative results or insignificant results, because if none of those gets published, then it's almost, I guess it would be a law of averages. It would just be over time, like something's going to come through that's going to be positive. And then, right. So I do think, that it could be related as well. And, there's this pressure from the journals to keep their impact factor high and have people cite their research, which you're more likely to cite research that has positive results. So there's kind of not a great incentive there in a sense, but I think a lot of people, like I said, good scientists are going to recognize that we should be publishing results that are non-significant. And so
you mentioned
still something.
And you mentioned before when talking about skepticism that it's about things like asking for a higher level of evidence when it comes to assessing claims. So can you talk about levels of evidence and how would you rank different levels of evidence? What should people think about when they are assessing claims?
I'm just going to break the fourth wall and say, Michael, your transitions are pretty amazing.
Oh, thank you.
That was a good one. So yeah, in terms of levels of evidence, there's different sources will give you slightly different ways to look at it. But the primary thing, the take-home method is, or the take-home message with understanding levels of evidence, is that there's higher and lower levels of certainties and better ways to understand things. So, for example, like some research methods books would say something like tenacity would be the lowest level of knowing, and that would be, basically holding on to beliefs just because they've always been accepted as facts, or you believe them out of superstition. Like you just know them because you've always known them, but your beliefs are inflexible. And the next level up from that would be kind of knowing.
Can you give an example?
Yeah.
Can you give an example of each level? I think that would be helpful.
Oh yeah, for sure. So like tenacity, I think probably one of the most annoying ones for an exercise physiologists and probably even coaches nowadays, hopefully coaches, is people are saying like, oh yeah, my legs are really burning from all that lactate. Well, we've known for 35, 40 years now that that's not the case. And like lactate isn't what we thought it was 40 years ago. Yet that is still that ideas around lactate are still very persistent in the culture. So that would be kind of knowing, like I know about lactate because of these things I've heard my whole life about it, but is it actually true? And I'll tell you, like I ran face first into that in my first exercise physiology course, even though I had already come out of an undergrad in physiology. They don't talk about lactate the same way that exercise physiologists talk about. And I just remember it was taught by my advisor, and he just was like, the look on his face was like, oh my God, who did I just bring into the program here? But yeah, like things like that happen to people with science backgrounds all the time. I've heard people say things like, I've heard geneticists say that that plants don't have mitochondria, things like that. They definitely have mitochondria, right? But that's a biology thing, I guess. But so is that? Yeah.
Yep. That's a good example.
Yeah. Then the next one would be intuition. And that's just knowing something based on the gut and based off of kind of your feeling. So again, not really great. But what's funny about that one, I had a little bit of thinking about that today, is once you get to a point when you've been reading and studying something for a really, really long time, you do start to forget where you know things from. And so you're like, I don't know where I know that from, but I think I read it or I heard it in this class or something like that. So those things could potentially becoming gut feelings. But it's still at the same time, if I can't recall where I know something from, I'm trying to be cautious and say like, I have this feeling that it's probably like this, right? So at least when I would be talking about it, I'd be kind of tagging it as this is just a gut feeling. But you can see how it would be kind of problematic to like base all of your beliefs based off of gut feelings, right? Like,
yeah, but it could be that. I mean, to me, that seems different though. If you have learned a lot about a topic and you don't necessarily remember where all of your information comes from, that could still be, I would classify that as knowledge. You don't necessarily have the capacity to immediately reference it. But that can be different than somebody who has not studied the topic or learned a lot about the topic, and they can have a feeling that, well, I should probably do high intensity interval training if I want to improve my performance, that sort of thing. So that's different than, let's say, if you've done your PhD in high intensity interval training, or well, not even that, but maybe you have done some kind of learning about it, and you know some things, but you don't remember the exact details. But that's a different kind of knowledge. It's not. I would say that's a kind of knowledge rather than gut feeling. So would you disagree with that?
You're breaking up a little bit. Do you want to repeat it?
I just think that if you have learned something in the past, then it's not necessarily gut feeling just because you can't reference where the knowledge comes from. So,
yeah. And I think that's getting that gut feeling from an expert in something is probably a little bit better than getting a gut feeling from someone that isn't an expert.
Yeah.
And that kind of touches on the Dunning-Kruger effect a little bit. I throw that one in there. Have you ever heard of that before?
Yes. The more when you learn more, when you don't know anything, you think that you know much more than you do. Then you start to learn more, and you realize how little you know. And then when you learn a lot more, you get to that kind of expert level. Then it starts to go up again. You do know quite a bit, but you don't get to that absurd level of confidence that you have when you don't really know anything.
Yeah, and I think there's on your outline here, I think there's a good place. So I'll put in a couple anecdotes around that are kind of hopefully eye-opening for people in terms of expertise and knowledge and certainty and that type of stuff. But yeah, I guess if we wanted to move into the next type of a knowing would be the knowing from authority, which it could be, if you know something because you read it in a blog, or you know something because you heard it from a coach, or you know something because you heard it on a podcast even. These are types of knowing through authority. And I guess with training, one thing that I talk with my athletes about is that when you go into your week in training peaks and, you've set up the week for your athlete, what most athletes are going to perceive that as is from Monday to Sunday is all the same level of evidence to them. It's an argument from authority. Coach set this out, therefore do it, therefore will work, right? But one of the things I try to explain with my athletes is that you might see that as an argument from authority, but like when I put those things in there, each one of those workouts has a different level of evidence that I would have attached to them. So if we're going to use the interval analogy, we're just going to keep, I guess it's going to be the theme of the podcast here. But, if I put intervals in for the week, I'm going to have a fairly high level of certainty about the effectiveness of those intervals that I'm prescribing. But maybe later in the week, they have a race, and the day before that, I have a pre-race interval session set up for them. Well, I had to reason my conclusion around that interval or that interval session and its effectiveness. And so because I have a less amount of certainty about it, I want my athletes to understand that there's different levels of certainty in my decision making, so that if something isn't working for them, it's not like I said, this authority figure just kind of giving in something in terms of being very dogmatic about it. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or something similar.
No, just to clarify, you're saying that doing intervals as part of a, let's say, general preparation program to improve your fitness, there's a high level of evidence for that. But doing intervals the day before a race to perform better on race day, there's not that much scientific evidence for that. So it's more about things like experience, anecdotal evidence, and even, as you said, reasoning. Why might this work? What might the mechanisms be, even though you don't necessarily know it? Logical reasoning. But that's not the same level of evidence as the intervals you did just for fitness improvement earlier in the week.
Yeah. So behind the scenes, there's different levels of evidence, but for the athlete, they're probably just looking at that whole week with the same level of evidence, right? As an argument from authority. Yeah. And then I guess the next one would be reasoning. And I think some books call this rationalizing, but, reasoning conclusions to things. So, for example, if you were going to, for example, like maybe this example is a little bit dated, but because I guess we have a little bit of evidence to come to a conclusion on this. But let's say, like, if you get hot, you're going to perform worse in terms of endurance performance. Okay, but if you look at a white kit versus a black kit, well, black absorbs more heat energy, or radiation. And so you could assume that kit might warm up more and therefore affect the thermoregulation of the athlete. And therefore, if you're given the choice between a white and a black kit, in terms of like which one you want to wear to a hot, bright race here in Australia, then maybe you might pick the white kit over the black kit, just for the reason conclusion. Now, if you talk to Simon Jones, I guess they did some research on it when he was back at Sky, and that's not as big of a difference as you might think. So you can see like how actual science would go against the reason conclusion. But a lot of times there's a lot of reasoning that goes on behind the scenes in coaching. I think a lot more than we maybe care to recognize, but we have to kind of say that there is high levels of, there's a good chance that our reasoned conclusions can be faulty if we're lacking science. So, right, in lieu of science and coming up with a reasoned conclusion to something, then we should be aware that it is just a reasoned conclusion, and it is not as high on the level of evidence as like actually having numerous scientific studies to base your conclusions on. So then I guess the last one would be scientific method, or knowing through the scientific method. Although, like I said, some books would have between reasoning and rationalizing, they would have empiricism, which should be gaining knowledge or have through observation, but maybe like a less structured form of observation than the scientific method. Yeah. But yeah, the scientific method, that kind of structured way of finding truth is, that's the highest knowledge that we have. And that you could say, how do we know that's the best? And you could just say, well, because it works, right? You can just look at places like medicine. There's a good example where, just from the point where we decided to start having science-based medicine, the practice of medicine and its outcomes have greatly benefited. And so in this whole conversation, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can look to medicine for a lot of this because there's a lot more money in medicine. There's a lot more people in medicine, and this is how they are thinking already. So it's not like I'm coming up with anything spectacular here. This is something that, a much bigger and well-funded field is already blazing the trail with. We're just kind of borrowing ideas from them, and at the end of the day. So, but one of the things maybe a lot of people don't understand, and this could probably be its own podcast episode within itself, is just talking about how you apply science. Because even within scientific studies, not all scientific studies are at the same level of evidence. You can't just throw down like one study and just be like, this is it, because, right, so there's, a well-done meta-analysis is going to be better than maybe a training study with no control, right? Or like a retrospective study versus a prospective study. And just kind of, and realizing maybe something with athletes like pro cyclists, maybe that's all you're ever going to get is these rough retrospective studies, because like Schrodinger's cat, like if actually taking the measurements or the measurements that you'd want to take from a pro cyclist could actually affect the outcome. If you're, one of the examples I use is if you want, you're never going to probably know what's going on within the muscle of an athlete in the Tour de France in the middle of that event, because you would need a muscle biopsy And as soon as you take that muscle biopsy, that person's race is over. That would be just silly to do that until we come up with some very non-invasive ways of investigating those things, right? But I guess it's really important that when you are, using science and reading studies and things like that, to understand that there's bad studies out there. There's studies that are done well, but aren't going to be considered as high a piece of evidence as other ones. So the tricky thing, I think, here in practice is just kind of keeping them all in your mind and trying to understand where you got your information and kind of, even if you can't remember if it was a good study or not, or maybe you don't have the wherewithal to consider them all, or to consider where you're getting the information and how you're coming to that conclusion. I guess just trying to hold on to it as much as possible and having the argument there and the references there so that you can understand when something else is coming in that would make you change your mind. Does that make sense to you, I guess? Yeah,
definitely it does. And I think, at least how I think about it is when reading scientific literature is one thing that I'm looking for is there any kind of scientific consensus around the topic, or is there not scientific consensus? And if there is some kind of consensus, I mean, the point with science and the scientific method is that we should never say anything with like 100% certainty, but you can increase your confidence in something being true versus not true. If you have a lot of studies, a lot of good meta-analysis, you have large controlled studies on a topic made by multiple research groups, not just one. So all of those sorts of things, and that's where actually tools like Twitter can also be quite useful to see what the scientists themselves are saying, what discussions they're having. Is there a lot of debate around whether certain papers are or certain topics are valid or if there's consensus around them or not, basically.
Yeah. And what's crazy is like when you look in the Twitter sphere or in the layman's areas or the blogs or something like that, of like how certain people are about things like maybe like polarized training, and then you look at scientists are still debating it, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's those counterpoints that came out on MSSE between it was like Mark Burnley and Jones versus Carl Foster and Seiler, and I'm sorry that I'm forgetting the other authors on those papers, but those were the two cohorts of pro and against. And, I went and read through all of that, and basically the take home from that was a nice exchange, but I question of whether Seiler and Foster are really from like the sources that they were actually citing to promote their case. I don't even know if they were like really great sources to promote those cases. It's not a dish on them or anything like that. I think it was an enjoyable exercise, I think, for both. I think there didn't seem to be any kind of animosity and I don't think there was any kind of like ideological clinging. I just think that it was like, here's our evidence. And another side was like, nah, that's nah. Yeah, nah. This is Mark Burnley's phrase. Yeah, nah. That's an Australian phrase, but if you were going to ask Mark Burnley what his favorite thing is just saying yeah, nah to things. So
yeah. Mark Burnley was on the podcast to talk about that in the beginning of 2022. So I'll link to that episode in the show notes. But yeah, that was a really good example. And I think also it would be easy to listen to, for example, or read that exchange, or even more so if you just listen to, because I didn't have the other side on the podcast after that exchange. I only had Mark Burnley on to discuss it because we also had some other things to discuss. But if you listen to that episode with Mark Burnley, it would be easy as a, let's say, layman to just get the conclusion that, okay, polarized training doesn't work. That wasn't the point of the exchange. The point was that, is there evidence that polarized training is better than other training intensive distributions or not? And that was what Burnley and colleagues were arguing against, and I guess put down some pretty good arguments for why there's not evidence to say that polarized training is better than other methods.
Yeah. But if you end up all of a sudden training in that way and it works for you, more power to you, right?
Yeah.
Like no judgment here. I'm sure even Mark Burnley wouldn't be. It'd be like, good, you've gotten faster, and I think that's basically what they were saying. They were like, yeah, you can do either, maybe, and get benefits from either. Right,
exactly.
Right? So, I think it's an interesting conversation, and one of the things when I always look at it, I was like, there's this one big similarity between them both, and that's a large amount of volume at a low intensity. So take that. That's what I take home from that conversation. Is that is important, at least from what we can tell. So I guess one of the questions that's important to ask is related to this conversation, since we're talking about science here, is what does it mean to train with science? I think you and I would probably both agree it's really sexy within the coaching world to say this is science-based, right? Or this is evidence-based. And so I'll take you down a rabbit hole real quick here about this. Well, let's have a thought experiment, and let's imagine that you were able to read every single scientific paper about training, physiology, all that kind of stuff. You were able to read it all, and you were able to retain it all. That'd be, again, getting into this omniscient type of being. Even if you could read all of the papers out there and retain it all, you still wouldn't be able to make every single decision in your training of you and your athletes based on science. At some points, you're going to have to reason a conclusion about something. You're going to have to go from the gut. You're going to have to use these lower forms of evidence, right? So this is like one end of the spectrum. So there's just no way to always make every single decision based solely on some kind of research that's available. But on the other side, you could have imagined like some, coach that doesn't read any science, doesn't want to be associated with the science claims or being, he's just, someone's dad or something like that, right? We can kind of conceive of this individual. At some point, this person is going to accidentally, if they're worth their salts in endurance performance and they make athletes get faster, they're going to stumble into something that's science-based, right? They're going to prescribe intervals along the way. They're going to increase volume, or, they're going to tell their athlete to eat more carbs at some point. Like they're just going to stumble into something that's science-based. So these are our 2 points on that spectrum. So somewhere in between that, we all fall on there. And so if even the most science-based person can't be making all of their decisions off of science, and even the least likely person to consider themselves science-based is somehow falling into science-based decisions, we really have to kind of say, well, what is being science-based, right? And that comes down to probably a conversation that you're going to have. If you're the athlete, you'd be asking the coach specifically, well, what makes you science-based? And so I always think that's kind of an interesting bit of skepticism on my point, and maybe a little bit of buyer beware or whatever. I don't know. What's your thoughts, Michael?
Yeah, I guess I would actually look at it a bit different. Like I would say that the person that does things more based on experience, let's say, and not reading the science papers, but they are stumbling upon things that are still in the scientific literature, I wouldn't call them science-based, because they are using it more based on experience. So I wouldn't even, you say that they fall in spectrum. I agree in terms of what their methods, what they do, but not in terms of, but I don't place any value in the science-based let's say, title or label necessarily, because there are examples of great coaches that have achieved great results that would not be at all science-based, or at least very little science-based per se. They would, even though, as you say, a lot of the methods would be overlapping with what is also known from the scientific literature. So the way I would think about it is what I would put value in as not as a label, because everybody can say that they're performance based, but actually like just thinking about what is the performance outcome, like what are the improvements that you can get for your athletes or get for yourself if you're a self-coached athlete, and then using all the different tools at your disposal, which could be reading the scientific literature, but it could also be being really, let's say, almost like trying to reverse engineer things based on experimental data, empirical observations, as you said, that might not necessarily be scientific, but they could be empirical, and it could be a very detailed N=1 for you, especially with self-coached athletes or a coach working with an individual athlete. So those are, I think that's where I would fall. Like I agree with you on everybody exists on that spectrum, and but I would maybe use science-based more as a how much do you use that tool, and I think that it's a great tool to have. I do think it's a great tool to have, but I think that you also want to have other tools like your experience and your ability to try to reverse engineer things and use empirical observations and so
on. So I just thought of another question for you then. Taking over the show. Based on the video you watched, and based on the conversation that we've had so far, can you see a value or maybe a potential loss if someone was, I guess, just reading a lot of literature and not connecting it with a kind of epistemological approach like this? This is, I guess, a good way to point out the value of what we're talking about here is that you can just hop into all of these papers and, read them all. But I also think, like, if you don't have like a good epistemological framework and philosophy to go along with how you consume these and apply them into your practice, I think this is like the chassis to the engine almost, I think. What do you think?
So the question is if there can be if it could be negative, even if you read all the science and know a lot of the literature, but you don't have the critical thinking skills that we have been talking about here to apply that. Is that the question? Can you maybe I'm leading you a little bit here, but can you see the benefit of where having this philosophy and understanding levels of knowledge and that type of stuff and would be like almost like an essential framework for just I think it's essential. It's a discussion I've had, not on the podcast because it's not about that, but actually in terms of how the world has changed in the last 30 years, or well, it's always changing, right? But let's say since I went to school, that a lot of the learning that you did was learning facts, right, from books, geography, biology, languages, mathematics, those sorts of things. But these days, what you really need when everything is at the tip of your finger with your mobile phone, that's not really useful. I mean, okay, there are some things that you should know because it's just like it's good to have like a little bit of facts that you have retained, but it's more about like even in schools at a very young age. Like I think people should be taught critical thinking skills and how to acquire information and be skeptical, those sorts of things. So I 100% agree, and that's why we're a big reason for having this conversation, that I think it's very important.
And it's funny, it's it could, if you're not into philosophy or something like that, it could be a really, really boring conversation. And I apologize to the listeners that aren't excited about this, but it's one of those things. It's like, it's like trying to train an athlete and having no care or concept of how physiology works. Right. To me, it's like that. And it's, it's good to know your philosophy and understand like how you're applying things and why you're applying things and that type of thing, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess we want to move on to the
let's move on. I think that we're going to get into things like pseudoscience and a bunch of other potential pitfalls that you might come across. So I want to go through those.
Yeah. So, in the video, I just kind of started listing off things that get in the way of finding truth and, create biases and things like that. So some of these overlap with each other, but we'll just start listing them off, I guess. Pseudoscience. Pseudoscience would be, for example, would be not good. If you look at the definition of pseudoscience, and I've found this out since I've done the formal definition of pseudoscience, as I understand it, is something that looks like science but is not falsifiable. So I think one of the examples I've seen for this is Freud's arguments about, whatever his things are, like, was it at the adipose complex or whatever, like, these things, like, they're not falsifiable because they're just like anything, like ones that you could, I'm trying to think of a good one for training though. I don't know. Do you have a good one for like pseudoscience or like something?
No,
that's
if that's the definition, I'm hard pressed. I mean, I would come back to the whole how like it's down to how much you want it. Coming back to that example that we talked about before. So that would be one.
Yeah. So pseudoscience would be something that would, like, you just can't falsify. So like, I guess a lot of these like people doing studies on I guess like alternative medicines, right? Where they show the benefits of something like what's with the needles? Like acupuncture, right? Yeah. And if you set up the study wrong, like there's just no way that there's no study that like convinces the practitioners that it doesn't exist, even though you go out pseudoscience is going to get in the way of that. So the other thing is people using anecdotes as data, but anecdotes are
still on pseudoscience. Yeah. I mean, I would say colloquially, that's not really how we think of pseudoscience necessarily, or at least not how I think about it. I would think about an example of pseudoscience would be, let's say, taking a very mechanistic study, like something happens at a cellular level, and then you extrapolate that to mean that, okay, this means that if we do this type of training that caused some sort of signaling in the cell, then it must also mean that you do this and you get these training effects or health effects. That's something that you see a lot, and it's also seen a lot in not in papers themselves as much even as in media, like Instagram accounts or podcasts or YouTube videos that are taking like these snapshots of like one study and then portraying them to be much more important and extrapolating from them. But I mean, I get, okay, that's not the definitions of pseudoscience, but that's a bit how I kind of understand the term, at least, and I think it's often used that way.
Yeah. I think I would agree as that is a colloquial definition, and that gets into one thing that an interesting conversation about applying science. If you have some type of, you do a study where you have an exercise bout. We're going to use high intensity intervals again. And let's say you after that, you take a blood draw and you look at maybe mRNA, and that mRNA is coding for a protein that is, that improves endurance performance. Now, that's a different level of knowing what the outcome is over doing an intervention with that and then seeing, the improvement in 20 kilometer time trial performance. So, so you have to, so it's one of those things where if all you have is an acute study, and they do this actually too within intervals, the whole time at or near VO2 max thing.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people use that as a proxy for how beneficial the interval bout is going to be. Now, that's problematic because there's not a lot of intervention studies have actually compared two different time at or near VO2 maxes. So there's probably, I think from my experience that there's more reviews around time at or near VO2 max than actual intervention studies on time at or near VO2 max. Someone can correct me on that or if I'm wrong. But, and then most people, I think, or a lot of people forget all of the nuance that are in those reviews, right? So, but if you have an acute interval study and it has a high time at or near VO2 max, and you're comparing that, you just have to say, well, you say, I'm going to use this because it has a high time at or near VO2 max. But I know it's not as certain as if I saw this within an actual training study.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm getting into where do you know what you know from? Just be like, well, and I think a good example of that was some of the Tabata style intervals with Ronested's stuff. Like at first, I think he came out with an acute study, and then I think that was followed up with a training study with the same intervals in it. And that's probably good study designed to like start out with the acute, get all of the data that you off the exercise bout acutely, and then use the intervals in that study, and then run a training study with it. That's kind of how I did it. There's a lot of problems around that, obviously, because what is the universal control for an interval study? That opens up a whole can of worms. But the point is that acute study totally useless because it's not a training study? No, it can still inform your practice. You just have to kind of put a pin in it as like, well, it's not a training study. It's not an intervention study. Or I'm sorry, it's not a meta-analysis. So because it's lower on the tier, you just are less certain of it. And if you're talking with an athlete about that hates this interval session, maybe realizing that you have less evidence for it than a whole body of research for it, maybe you can drop and put something else in because you just don't have enough to back it up for them, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that was, I think, a good tangent just to kind of get into like how to realize within the studies that you are looking at. The problem with that is if you all you have is molecular studies and you're coming out and you're saying something like, yeah, this intervention, or not even intervention, this exercise bout for whatever intervals or high torque intervals or whatever you want to call it, this thing here, and all I have is mRNA data for it, and then I'm comparing it into a whole body of research that's all training studies, and then you're saying, I don't know, like this benefits VO2 max more than this. That becomes problematic because you're taking lower forms of evidence and trying to make a case against this whole body of research. Now, it's not to say that they're wrong. Maybe if we ran a bunch of studies 10 years down the line, we might find out that they are correct. But the fact is they just don't have the evidence to back up their claim, and we should be honest about that. We should be, right. But yeah, I guess I don't know if there's anything else to dive into that.
No, you were just going to move on to anecdotes, I think.
Yeah. But yeah, here's like anecdotes are really super sexy for us, I think, as humans. And but anecdotes aren't data. Like your multiple anecdotes that something works. If you wear this, your lucky socks, and you win a race every time you wear those socks. And like that doesn't necessarily mean those socks make you win races, right? But like I said, we're humans. Our own experiences have a lot of weight on us. And I was actually just sitting down and recording with a bunch of like sports scientist mates and, having talking shop. And it came up like, we're all scientists here. We all think scientifically, but man, a sexy anecdote that within our practice, something like that, it really stands out. Like we're all susceptible to that. But at the same time, man, if you've got your anecdote that whatever intervention works, but there's a whole scientific body of research that says it doesn't, then what are we doing here? So I'd say you can't, but you should definitely be kind of critical of that thought process, I guess, and realizing that. The other thing that's really big with humans is just confirmation bias, right? And things like motivated reasoning and and pattern seeking. These are all things that we do. So you have to be really careful about that. And I think one of the big kind of confirmation biases I always find funny, a little bit frustrating, but let's bust this myth right here. And I'll get your feedback on it first. But what do you think of when people say coaches are ahead of the science?
That's a really interesting one. I don't think you can say that necessarily. I don't think you can say that. I think there are maybe things that coaches do that will later be proven by science to be effective, but it doesn't necessarily mean that coaches are ahead. They might be behind in other areas, and also the reason that they did that might be just random chance rather than like having some exceptional intelligence or knowledge that not available to others. So I think it's also it's a false dichotomy. I think it's a false dichotomy. So it's a bit of a controversial take that generates clicks and views. so I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. That's not to say that like science is ahead of coaches either, or that one is better than the other. But I just don't really agree with the premise that and then they're doing different things, right? So how can you compare it?
I'll try to unpack this and try to extend the olive branch but like I have to start out with being a little bit harsh. Like to me it's being a little bit intellectually arrogant. Like it's but to me it's also a confirmation bias because it's only remembering the instances where the coaches got it right, and there's no recollection of when maybe the coach's practice was dead wrong, right? Or when and so there's that part of it. And then also getting back to our levels of knowledge. Like, how do you know you're ahead of the science if you haven't done a science experiment to show that you're ahead of the science? Because so you can't say you're ahead of the science without the experiment happening, right? And then then it gets into like after the experiment happens and you're like, oh, we've been doing this for ages. Stupid scientists should have just caught up and done this science experiment, yada, yada, yada. Well, that's unfair. So so we have our criticisms here. And the other thing that would be along with that is, if you are saying, if I'm sitting here saying like we should try to be, and you are saying we should be trying to base as much as we can of our training off of science, that's not dogmatic, right? We're not trying to be dogmatic. We're just trying to push for better practice, and we're not saying I
just want to. I didn't say exactly that. That's not what I.
No. I'm just saying, like, for people that would be saying towards us,
okay,
like, if we're saying like, no, you guys aren't ahead of the science. Let's be real here. This isn't us trying to impose dogma. Right.
Yeah.
This isn't us trying to say you have to follow the science. Right.
No.
Science Nazis over here, something like that. But But the riff, we can end the riff. Let's look at what it really is, right? Coaching and science should be a mutualism. It should be, I'm going to use this word wrong, but it should be symbiotic in a sense. It should be, the scientists are asking the coaches and the practitioners what you think works, and then trying to come up with experiments that will help the practice along of whether or not it works. And then on the other side, the coaches will hopefully be appreciating that the scientists aren't the fastest things in the world sometimes. But we have to have this like back and forth, right? It's just, there's a number, and a number of the pro teams World Tour teams are doing that. You see, I'm going to miss a few of them, but like, you definitely see, DSM, they were publishing their research through Toon and Deo. I'm sure there was some other teams that Deo was working with. I just saw a paper with Truck Sigafredo, and two individuals from that team were on that paper, and I would imagine they were using Truck Sigafredo data. Like that's where we want to be, right? Like we want the scientists and the practitioners in the field working together, and we don't need to have this like, I don't know, like we were ahead of the science. Let's just be honest. Like that's just epistemologically not possible. I mean, you just got lucky in that one thing and you're just forgetting about the other. So let's be real and just cut the crap and work together. Right. Like let's move forward together, I guess. So I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that, but
no, I think it's, just to summarize, I guess coaching generates a lot of hypotheses that science can test, and some of them will be proven right, and some of them will be proven wrong. Also, depending on which coach it is, you could say that some coaches are a bit not ahead, but they use more of the hypotheses that end up being proven maybe correct rather than the ones that end up being proven wrong. And I mean, you could see, for example, now there's a reasonable amount of scientific evidence that the whole low carb, high fat thing isn't necessarily great for endurance performance. But we have had coaches have been using that before science started investigating it in the endurance sports context, really. Not everybody, but some coaches have been using that, and then you could say that, well, okay, some try that hypothesis, and I guess at least on average, based on what we know now, they probably didn't get it correct, but not everybody used it in the past. So,
and that actually brings up a really good example. I think breaking the fourth wall here again. When I broke the record for the pre-interval length, for when we were first talking about, not the pre-interval, but the pre-interview discussion, 3 hours, powered through that. But yeah, when we were talking about, I think we brought it up with, you get one triathlete that does well at Ironman, and they become like the pinnacle of what to do. And everyone forgets that all the other athletes that won before them that didn't do that thing. Right. Yeah. And I think when you brought up the low carb, high fat diet, I just remember it was a few years ago that guy won on it or something like that. And then before that, wasn't there a guy that won after training indoors the whole time or something like that? Like each one of these podiums brings up a whole new fad, but it's just funny how that works. Like this is exciting, it's new, and we connect with it, but we forget to look at like all of the observational data that we had before that.
Yeah. To be honest, in triathlon, in long distance triathlon in particular, I can really understand the temptation to do that because they're compared to road cycling or even Olympic distance and sprint distance triathlon. There's so little research. There's almost nothing, just because it's not interesting to study because it's not an Olympic sport. I mean, Olympics drive so much in science, and so there's very little in long distance triathlon. So I can really understand why people are looking at the anecdotes. But yeah, it's a dangerous thing to just go based on that.
And again, it comes back. It's not to say that this is wrong.
Yeah,
it's just a different level of evidence, and maybe we shouldn't be chasing after it just yet. Maybe we should hang back a little bit and watch it to see what really works. But this gets into a conversation about the latest and greatest, right? The latest, people are looking for the performance edge, so they want to get the latest bit, and all of a sudden you can't get, and we have the least amount of evidence and research about that new thing to understand how to best apply it. So it always is a constant battle of like, you want the new thing so you can get the performance advantage, but it takes time to determine truth and understand things. Right? Like we just saw this with the vaccines and COVID, and the longer the experiments ran, the better idea we had how the efficacy of those drugs or interventions or whatever. So same thing is with training, but instead of people's lives, it's your performance at a race. And, so some initial paper comes out for saying beetroot juice is going to improve your performance, and bang, you hop on that. And then maybe you realize when you look at that study, it was all done with like fit college students or something like that. And right. How much was so, but spending a few bucks on beetroot versus, maybe there's another intervention where you're locked inside of a hyperbaric chamber or something ridiculous like that. Right. So gets into
ketones. That's very expensive compared to juice.
Yeah, exactly. I guess the other thing that kind of works in with this is, well, there's the placebo effect of like, you spend your money on something, you spend your money on it, on those ketones, and then obviously they're going to work because you spent the money on it. You have that, but it's just it's your N of one, and the placebo effect is real, and it definitely has an effect. But one of the arguments I bring up is like, well, if you have all these placebo effects, some of them are placebos versus some that aren't placebos. Well, are all those placebo effects additive? Well, that's outside. I should probably look up the research on that because I asked that question quite a bit. But it is a question to think about. Like, all right, well, if I've got these arrow booties on and they're really just a placebo effect, and I have this other thing over here that I know is a placebo effect, well, do I get more performance because I've added the booties and the other supplement together that are both placebo effects? Not to say, booties are just a placebo effect, but you know what I mean? Yeah. So then there's just like logical fallacies.
But we didn't say, okay, here, devil's advocate. Yeah. We didn't say it makes sense to, like, if you go for one intervention that probably might have a placebo effect, whether it's for performance or recovery, like you can have your beetroot juice before a race or your booties for recovery. What is wrong? Is there any reason not to do that if you actually get that effect, even if it's from placebo?
Yes, cost. Everything has a cost.
But if it's worth it to you, like you want that 0.5% improvement or 1% improvement.
Yeah, if an athlete has a security blanket that they need, like, tread carefully. Right? Like one of the take homes with one of this is that, like, true or not true, you always have to lay it within the context of what the athlete will do. You could have, I think, a good example of that, going back to intervals and pacing. There's some evidence to show that if you just do all out efforts, like when you just go out and you go hard as you can for 3 minutes, say you have 6x3s, and you just go hard as you can, and the power output decays over time, and the average output of those intervals would decay over time with that pacing, where every single effort was an all-out effort. I think there's evidence out there that would probably support that would have a higher at or near VO2 max. Now, I think that's better. I think there's I think there's evidence to say that that is better than just doing your intervals maximally paced as to try to get the highest average across them all. Now, guess which one I have my athletes do?
Well, based on the question, I'm going to guess the latter one, and or is that correct?
The one
So
that's
maximally paced. Yeah, best effort
across all
average,
all
best average.
Yeah. So that's the way I go, because in the context of the athlete, the first one is miserable and it's unsustainable.
Yeah.
And over time with the athlete, what is sustainable was getting into my coaching philosophy, I guess. So you can come up with an argument that say that this way is better than the other, but really, is it worth it versus the other one in the context of the athlete? But then there's so just logical fallacies get in the way. So those are always good to know, like post hoc ergo propter hoc, like after this, therefore because of this. Again, it gets into I did this and I saw a benefit after it, and this is the only thing that explains it, right? Only the ketones explains me winning this race. Only riding on the trainer explains winning that race. Only the low carb, high fat explains winning that race. Like that's post hoc ergo propter hoc. Like there's probably a lot of other things that goes on. Like maybe like most athletes have chosen the right parents, so don't forget that. But there's what we'll call something like the argumentum ad populum. And I actually have one that I've changed called the intervention ad populum. They're like, everyone does this and it's always been done. Therefore, I will do it too. So, things like the high torque sessions, everyone does this. This pro team does it. Therefore, I will do it too. Everyone does stomp drills. I'm going to do stomp drills. Everyone does high cadence drills. I will do them. Doing something just because everyone else seems to be doing it, or what's within the culture. And I was have a little bit of a tangent on that. Like when I first got coached, I wasn't brought up through a junior program or anything like that, where you start out, in a state system or with a Devo team. I eventually was on a Devo team, but not really young. By the time I was coached, I had already had like a hard science degree. And you and I both know, like that initial process in some kind of STEM field will at least start to heightening your critical thinking faculties, right? So, or abilities. So,
just science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, just for those. STEM.
Yeah, and so when my coach was prescribing things to me, and I was right out of my first degree, I always had in the back of my head, like, how does he know this works? What evidence does he have for this? So that was always the scientist kind of thinking about this. And that's what kind of got me down this path of going into exercise physiology, but also kind of questioning the thought process behind it of how certain is he that this is even going to work for me? And, when people start making up intervals of like, and thinking about like what the outcome is going to be, like, how do they know that? Like, how do we know? Why do you think 2-minute intervals are good for crits? Why? Right? Like not you, but other people, right? Like, longer intervals are for this and shorter intervals are for this. Okay. Why? Like I'm interested. Right. But yeah, I guess that's just having conversations around that type of thing is for me personally, in terms of coaching philosophy, I think I have a very small library of workouts. And I think a lot of them I haven't used in a long time. I just think there's a lot of stuff out there that doesn't have evidence for it. So why have someone do something that doesn't have great evidence for it when you can just have them ride their bike?
So without going into the details of it, what is that short list of workouts that you have?
Definitely high intensity interval training.
Mm-hmm.
But different, like I guess classic high intensity interval training. I have some of the Tabata style ones, and then the rest is this things that are in, I guess, arguably in the heavy and moderate domain are prescribed to try to hit those domains. And, like over-unders for me, I haven't prescribed those in years. They just seem weird to me to like do that. I think there's research out there that shows it's not really that great. But like stomp drills, I could bring those up. I don't have those. I don't do a lot of cadence stuff.
What are the things you do in the heavy domain? Because that's something that always has me thinking that there's not that much evidence that I've seen anyway on intervals in the heavy domain or workouts in the heavy domain. So yeah, what do you do there? Like classic threshold or tempo or?
Honestly, they're really handy for people who have day jobs to get a lot of training stress in 2 hours.
Yeah.
I mean, right. And there's a lot of other like hypotheses that I have.
But that would be an example of the evidence for them would be more along the lines of reasoning and experience rather than scientific evidence.
Yeah. And you can say like acutely, I always forget this word, there's like that isocapnic response that's in between the two ventilatory thresholds, so that you could say, well, there's somewhere to start a hypothesis because there's something physiologically unique there. And I think there's also some research that has been out there that shows, I think like different molecular markers that occur after exercising in different domains. So we're at least starting to understand that, right? I always think it's crazy when you look at the literature how much we really understand versus like how complex some interval studies get, or how complex some interventions and workouts get from coaches. People that argue just the smallest details about something, and you're like, how did we get to this point of understanding something that fine when there's so many other things, there's so many cascades that could show that not to be correct, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, having cherished intervals could be potentially detrimental. Like thinking like this is absolutely works. And I guess it could jump ahead and I'll throw something at you here. Do you ever watch Veritasium?
No, I haven't. Don't know what it is.
Okay, Veritasium is like a big science-based YouTube channel. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm stealing it from them. I'm definitely stealing it from them. So I have a rule that I'm thinking about, and I want you to guess what that rule is. And it's a rule about a set of numbers. It's a rule about numbers. And I'm going to get you a set of numbers, and I want you to give me a set of numbers back. I will tell you, so my set of numbers will follow the rule, and then you will give me your set of numbers, and you will try to tell me, we'll try to figure out if your set of numbers follows the rule, and then you're going to try to figure out what the rule is. Okay?
Right.
Okay. Hopefully I explained that correctly.
Yep.
All right. So my first series of numbers is 3, 6, 9. What's your series of numbers?
12, 15, 18.
Okay, so it follows my rule. What's my rule?
That it is a number that can be divided by 3.
No.
Right. So do I have to give a different set of numbers now? A different guess?
Yeah, we can just do that. I'll get my 3, 6, 9 was my first one. Unless you want me to give you another series.
Give me another series. Yeah, okay. That's how it works. Got it.
9, 12, 15.
So what can it be if it's not divided by 3?
Come on, I bet the listeners are just screaming at you. Yeah. All right.
Or is it just but
all you can do is
increments of 3. I'm going to try 1, 4, and 7. So increments of 3.
Okay, follows my rule. What's my rule? Increments of 3?
Yeah. Like you.
No,
add
that's not.
3.
You're wrong.
Okay.
Do you want to just keep throwing numbers at me?
One more example. Then you have to tell me if I can't get it.
Just throw some. Do I have to give you another set of numbers again?
Well, okay. Let me try this. 117.37
follows my rule.
Any whole number?
No.
Okay. Give me one more series, one more, and then if I don't get
360.90. I apologize for the editing you have to do for this, but you have to shorten it.
I think I give up. You have to tell me.
Okay. Well, what you should do is notice how you're like just keep trying to think what it is. You're using your bias to kind of formulate what your guesses are. Do something where you're not using your bias to formulate your guess. Do something crazy.
Okay. 100, 200, 300.
Okay, follows my rule. Get crazier.
1.5, 10,000, 5 million.
Follows my rule. Get crazier. You're coming up with hypotheses, and you're trying to prove them.
Those are not hypotheses. Those are just numbers.
Okay, so you're okay.
I can't find anything that does not follow your rule. Well, that's why I tried 1.5. Minus 2, minus 4, minus 6.
Doesn't follow my rule.
So any positive number?
No.
Yeah, no, you had to tell me. Sorry.
Any increasing numbers set.
An increasing number. Oh, okay.
So if you would have said 8, 2, 7, I would have said it doesn't follow my rule. So that's what I was trying to get you to. So funny how that works, though. What would have in that scenario, what would have really given you the most information is to give something that would have been totally left field, is to try to disprove what your thinking was. But most people, the first thing they do when they hear 369 is to do what you did. Yeah. Give so they're thinking of what the rule is, and they're trying to emulate it, right? As opposed to throwing the rule out the window and trying to disprove it. And people are like, well, what does this have to do with endurance training? Well, it has a lot to do with it, I think. Because if you're the athlete that says, well, I do stomp drills every year and I get a really good sprint from it, therefore that works. Well, your idea is that it works already and you're putting it in every year. What would really tell you if it didn't work or not is if you didn't do it. And people might be afraid to do that because, okay, well, now I have a year where maybe my athlete isn't able to sprint as well because he didn't do his stomp drills or didn't do this intervention or didn't do that intervention. But at the same time, you can argue, well, maybe you have people chasing after a bunch of workouts and interventions that don't work as well as you think they do, and you could just have them riding their bike.
Yep.
So, it's funny how our brain works like that. And this is kind of how, coming from building a lot of my process from the ground up and having an understanding of what evidence there is for everything, and when I will limit its use and when I won't use it, when I will use it and when I won't use it. Like, there's certain things that that are old that I will use in certain situations. Maybe it's a trainer and they just need something that keep their mind busy. Does it have to be super science based? If it helps them get through the trainer season, something like that, right? But at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that I've coach successful athletes, and they've never touched some of these interventions that would be really common, I would say. And
can you give examples of those interventions that they have not?
High torque intervals, right. And maybe, I guess we get into a little bit of a conversation about that, and like as an exercise as well. Like there's people that are promoting it, and one of these people that promoted it on Twitter, I asked them, I was like just curious. It's like, well, last time I checked the literature on it, there was a literature review by last author was Ronestad. I forget who was first author, but this is 2014 or 16 or something like that, and it's been a while. So maybe they've had some new studies out. And this person that was promoting it had a very specific intervention or workout that they were prescribing, And I was like, oh, well, if he's a sports scientist and he's prescribing these, we must have like some good research out now since the last time I checked up on it. So I just asked, and I was like, all right, well, do you have a good training study for this? And the response was an acute study. It was one of Peter Leo's new study, which I haven't had a chance to read, but it just showed the importance of torque within pro cyclists. And this gets into, well, this is a reasoned conclusion, right? That this is important. Simply just saying that having a high torque results in high torque for that. I can see the reasoning for it, but I think one of the big points is that they were saying it was fundamental. And to me, I think you would need a higher level of evidence if you're going to call something fundamental. To me, like high intensity interval training it's fair to say is fundamental because we have a lot of evidence and papers to show that. You could probably say that with high volume, low intensity training. I think we have a lot of evidence for that. And I think we have a lot of evidence for carbohydrate ingestion. But to say it's fundamental, do we want to call this fundamental if we don't have any training studies to show this is beneficial?
Yeah.
And that just digressed. It just turned into a whatever. But one of the responses that was said to me was that this intervention causes a complicated cascade, and it's hard to isolate and all of these things. And I respect this person a lot, but I came back and I just said, well, every training intervention ever has a complicated cascade, physiology, neuromuscular, yada, 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 and is arguably hard to isolate to an extent. So this is just kind of special pleading for this intervention. Now, I have to be careful. Like, I'm not saying no, we shouldn't do it. You go ahead and do it if you feel it has benefits. And I honestly hope it does have benefits, because I would hate to have all these athletes that have been doing it for years and it has no benefit. But one of the other things with the high saying, here's high torque, and it's we see high torque in professional athletes, therefore training intervention. Well, my thinking is well, if you did training in any other training intervention that's out there that has evidence for it, and you didn't see an increase, you saw an increase in power over a 40K or whatever, and you didn't see an increase in cadence, wouldn't you assume that also increased torque?
Yeah.
So wouldn't there be a bunch of other things that increase torque too without having to actually do torque intervals? Mm-hmm. So I could totally see how it would be a missing stimulant. I can definitely see how it would be kind of a missing piece in a puzzle, maybe with really highly trained people or something like that. But let's get together and do some real training studies before we have a definite conclusion about this is how we even run the intervention, right? Mm-hmm. So touchy subject for people, but I think it's a good one to look at because it's kind of big right now, right? And this isn't something I've done a super big deep dive on it. I just can. But again, getting back to having an understanding of this process, at least I can lay out the argument and say, this is what I would like to see in order for me to fully accept this as fundamental, right? Like I can lay the right.
Do you have any other pet peeves, training interventions or similar?
Yeah. So, man, I've got tons of them. I think, I guess some of the ones that are like the cooling base layers. Man, the cooling base layers on hot days, it's just funny to me. Like, for all of mankind, we've been putting on more layers of clothing to stay warm and taking off layers of clothing to stay cool. But the modern cyclist is now putting on layers in order to stay cool. Now, again, it goes back to, I'm just reasoning a conclusion that this is probably hotter. And there's a lot of people that have spent their money on this that are, have motivated reasoning to an extent to say, well, it feels good for me. But at the end of the day, really the burden of proof is on the manufacturers of the cooling base layers to do some third party studies. This will probably never happen, but some third party studies in hot environments with trained cyclists, with and without the with and without the base cooling base layer on, right? Like that's how. And to my knowledge, I don't think that exists, but it could. But it seems there. It's an uphill fight, I think. But that is one of the things that kind of comes to mind because it's hot down here. But the other one that kind of that gets me, and I talk about quite a bit, is and this is one for coaches, and I wish with coaches, you and me, Michael, we're going to bind together on this. Is this idea of the technological black boxes that are becoming more prevalent, I guess. Yeah. Now, and this, okay, so for example, like maybe like the Garmin watch is spitting out your VO2 max interval, or your VO2 max after you did a hard 5-minute effort or something like that. Yeah. If you bought the watch and you're looking at that, then okay, that's a black box I can live with. Like that's a black box that can be sorted out with the free market, right? If you don't believe that, then maybe you don't see any value in that number getting spit out to you without ever being on a Met cart, then okay. But the problem where I do have the problem with the technological black boxes is when there is technology that's specifically marketed to coaches to work with athletes. And this gets into like, what is HRTSS, for example? Do you know what that is?
I kind of know how it's calculated, I guess, or the principles of it, not exact formula maybe, but
yeah, I use it. I don't know. Do you use it as well?
I don't use TSS at all, to be honest. So
okay. Yeah. But there's
I couldn't care less.
Yeah. But I think you kind of grasp the concept of.
I mean, I'm thinking of things like you mentioned Garmin and the VO2 Max. Like that's pretty harmless, but the Garmin's now they will give you suggestions. Today's suggestions: 40-minute base run, 1 hour interval bike. They say those sorts of things, and that's completely based on the black box. You have things like the Whoop and similar devices that take a bunch of scores and try to put them together into some sort of composite score, and then they give you advice for what you should or shouldn't do that day. Again, completely black box. You have various attempts at AI software that is also a kind of black box, which would be fine if there was any evidence that it actually gave you good training, which there isn't, to my knowledge. Those sorts of things. I think that actually attempt to give actionable advice, but there's no transparency in how it's in how it's done, and no evidence that it works. That's I agree with that as an issue.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have any issue if someone just bought that watch. I think it's more of, I think maybe what you're talking about is you have an athlete that gets a workout spit to them that is out to them that is completely different than what you're prescribing for them, and now you have another cook in the kitchen.
I'm also thinking. No, I don't. That's never happened to me. So I don't have a problem with that. The problem, I think, is for self-coached athletes. If they just go and follow what the Garmin says, I think there are better ways to go about it. Even just some free training plans on the internet, I think, would be potentially better than the Garmin, at least as long as we don't know what it bases things off. Definitely some paid training plans would be a lot better. Yeah. And there's just, I think that it's for self-coach athletes that kind of thing in particular is a problem. But I do think that sometimes the Whoop and similar recovery devices that can be a bit more, I guess, problematic in a coach-athlete relationship as well. And not cause friction between the coach and the athlete. I never had that happen, but maybe the athlete forgets to just listen to their body and how they feel.
Yeah.
We were going to talk about your coaching philosophy, but we have been talking for an hour 45 minutes. So I think we'll have to leave that for another episode, actually, because I have another call coming up soon. But let's do the rapid fire questions and take just one sentence to answer these. And the first one is, what's your favorite book or resource related to endurance sports?
Every time I get a book that's related to endurance sport, I never get a chance to read it because I usually just am collecting papers. And that's my go-to source. So, just reading papers.
And what's an important habit that you have benefited from athletically, professionally, or personally?
Riding my bike, of course.
And who?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And who's somebody that you look up to or that has inspired you?
Mostly my academic mentors over the years. So, Stephen Albrechtsen from my undergrad, Dr. Stephen McGregor from my master's, Professor Jerry Dempsey from in between my master's and my PhD, and then my PhD supervisors, which were Chris Abyss, Dr. Paulo Benespa, and Jeremiah Pfeiffer. Well, all of them are doctors, but all those individuals, the mentoring. And these are the people that I look up to, and it gave me a lot of, help with developing the insight into my training process and my coaching, and then all the critical thinking and that type of thing. So, I look up to them. I also look up to kind of what I would say the people that are the newer kind of cycling performance paradigm type people, like the Deo Sanders in the worlds and the Toon Van Erps and Peter Leo, James Sprague, all these guys that are doing the science, getting PhDs in it, and then also having that close coaching relationship with the athletes as well. Those are individuals that I look up, that the practitioners, I guess. There's a number of other people out there that would fit into that too, but those are that I don't want to make them belittle them or anything like that. I just haven't had a chance to sit down and talk with them yet. Right.
Yeah. So that's a good list. And where can listeners find you and your coaching?
I have a website. It's boyntoncoaching.com. I'm on Twitter at Boynton Coaching. I have a Instagram, Boynton_coaching. I think that's what that is. But if you want to get a hold of me, you can get a hold of me through the website. There's a contact form there. Currently taking on athletes, if you like what I have to say, and you like the conversations and how I look at things, even though we didn't get a chance to get to my philosophy of it. But you can always hit me up and we can get deeper into that philosophy conversation one-on-one if someone's interested. So,
all right. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much, Jason. It was a great chat and looking forward to doing it again soon.
Oh, yeah. Well, we didn't really talk about the research and hopefully come on when that finally gets published. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Great. Well, take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed that interview. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com and links to Jason's website, ResearchGate, and Twitter profiles. And of course, the Cycling Performance Club podcast. Also, we mentioned a number of names of people that have in the past been guests on the triathlon show, including Mark Burnley, Theon Van Erp, Peter Leo, and those episodes I will also link to in the show notes, as well as a related episode, the only previous episode I've done on the concept of, let's say, critical thinking and skepticism, and that's with Dr. Nicholas Tiller. That was back in episode 239, and he is the author of The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science, so that episode is well worth listening to if you enjoyed today's conversation. Next Monday, I'll interview professional triathlete Frederick Funk. And this is something that I did talk about at the very start of this year when I went through the listener survey and basically talked about what this means for how I will produce content this year and possibly further than that. And anyway, the one thing that I talked about was that I will trial to interview a few pro athletes and see how that goes and how well it is received. And this is the first one of those episodes. And I'll tell you what, so far I love it because Frederick was really, completely open and transparent with all of his training, all of his numbers and data. And we do go into that in great detail. There's no holding back or anything. So that is a really good, fun episode to listen to if you're into that kind of stuff for sure. If you want to improve your triathlon performance and want some help to achieve your goals, big or small, then consider working with a scientific triathlon coach or a training plan. We have options for you, whether you're just getting into triathlon or you're trying to qualify for a world championship or even want to race professionally. And we would love to discuss further around if and how we can help you on your triathlon journey. Find out more and contact us on scientifictriathlon.com, and we look forward to connecting with you. Big thanks finally to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. Use their free fuel and hydration planner to understand your fluid, electrolyte, and carbohydrate needs and get a specific and effective race strategy, and book a free video consultation with the team if you want to refine it further. And use the code TTS23 at checkout for 15% off your first order. And thank you to ZEN8. Use the ZEN8 Swim Trainer to improve your technique, power, stamina, and swim training consistency. You can try the ZEN8 risk-free for up to 30 days and get the special ZEN8 bundle that includes the swim trainer and a number of ZEN8 training plans and on-demand workouts on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.